Thanks for coming, and thanks for keeping it independent. Chris McCauley, Christopher, where are you? Told me about Julia's life, and she's got such an incredible life that I hope you talk a little bit about before you talk about your book, Banker's Blacklist. But just in a nutshell, right now, she's the assistant professor of political science at UCSB. Go Gauchos. But before that, she's also a published author in the terms of many numerous academic journals, as well as the New York Times or Washington Post. Washington Post and the Atlantic. And also, we're here to celebrate Banker's Blacklist. Prior to that, she worked at the U.S. State Department and for the FBI. So, again, please welcome Julia Morse. So, are you a spy?
No, but I was in the business of catching spies back in the day.
You were. What did you do for the FBI?
So I was an intelligence analyst for the counterintelligence division.
Wow. How many years did you do that?
I did that for almost 4 years.
And did you work at State before or after that?
State was after that. So I worked at the FBI for 4 years. I got my master's degree, and then I went to the State Department to work for the Bureau of Intelligence and Research, and then at the U.S. mission to the United Nations.
Wow. How did you transfer from government work to academic?
So I always kind of had in the back of my mind that maybe I'd like a PhD someday. And then when I was working at the State Department at the U.S. mission to the United Nations, I was on the sanctions team working on counterterrorism sanctions, actually. And I was interested in sort of understanding how countries work together to stop terrorists and things like that. And actually the origin for this book came out of that experience, because I thought, as someone who was interested in international organizations, I was at the Security Council, this is like the heart of action. This is where things are really happening in terms of counterterrorism. And I kept hearing about this small intergovernmental body called the Financial Action Task Force that I had never heard about before, I knew nothing about, and everyone kept saying, if you want to understand counterterrorism policy, look at this organization. This is what's really transforming the world. And so when I went back to graduate school and I studied international cooperation, I started looking into it more, and it's really just this incredibly effective organization that has transformed the way everyday people do banking. It's transformed the banking system, and I think there's a lot of policy lessons there.
What drives you as far as like wanting to do what you do?
So I think, like many people who go into political science, I wanted to make a difference in the world, and I think, to be honest, probably the way I feel the most impact on the world directly is through the students and through the teaching. But I think for me, researching this book felt like this opportunity to shed light on this kind of small technocratic organization that people hadn't heard about, and say, we might feel sometimes depressed about the ability of the world to solve problems, but actually there are cases where we have been really successful, and that we can draw a lot of lessons from that about thinking about other challenges like climate change, and there might be ways in which the kind of processes that have made the FATF so successful can be transported to other policy issues.
So you wanted to do this and pass it on to your students, but you also, by writing this book, you're giving a broader audience to people. And I was wondering what your goal was in writing this book, is to tell, what your goal was in telling the public about banking and the fairness.
Yeah, so I think it's interesting because as someone who studies international organizations, there's this whole level of cooperation and policy that exists that people just aren't aware of. We think about trade, and people don't think about how everything they buy in the stores is affected by international trade. And there's so much of our lives that are interconnected and based on how countries are working together. And this was an example of, how you bank, how much money you can send, how much, how much scrutiny they pay to your transactions. Everything is affected by these international standards that most people have never heard of. And so to me, it was a chance to kind of showcase and make accessible to people look at all of this stuff that's happening at a higher level that does impact your daily life, and you know, these are the kind of issues that we should broadly care about.
Indeed, indeed. How long did this whole process of writing this book take you?
Oh boy. So I think I first started researching it in 2014. I was working at State in 2011, so that's when the idea came to me. I started working on the project in 2014. I think the final copy of the manuscript was turned in maybe in January 2021, or maybe sometime. So yeah, almost, I would say 8 to 9 years. And that's pretty standard for academic books. They take a long time.
That's just as long as a novel then.
Oh yeah, longer probably. I think I could have written, in fact I did on the sidelines, yeah, could have written many novels in that time period.
We'll talk about that after then, about the next book after. Before we begin to talk about the book, I just want to know, were you instilled with this kind of sense of justice or something early in your life? Was there like some kind of seminal moment or time where you felt that call to serve?
I don't know. I think that's always been important to me. I think like I always had a understanding that I was really fortunate compared to a lot of people, and I just always felt like if you're born with advantages, like it's your kind of moral obligation to give back. And so for me, and I was fortunate to come from parents who kind of said, do whatever is important to you, follow your passion. And so I was able to go work at the government and think about things from a public service element. And I don't know, it's just always been how I am.
Well, we can't wait to hear about it. So do you want to go ahead and take it away now?
Okay.
Talk about and maybe read a little bit?
Yeah.
That would be great.
Yeah, so I was thinking maybe I would read a few parts from the book first and then talk a little bit about them, if that seems like it would work. So I thought I'd start with the introduction. I have to say, those of you who are familiar with academic books, they tend to vary in how engaging they are. So I got advice early on to try and put some interesting money laundering, terrorist financing anecdotes. And so I'm going to read some of those to give you a sense of the problem, and then I'll talk a little bit about the argument in the book. Okay. How would you steal $1 billion? In an era where banks rarely stockpile cash and their security measures rival the military, it seems an impossible feat. Yet, in February 2016, North Korean hackers almost pulled it off. Exploiting time zone differences, technological vulnerabilities, and weak points in financial regulation, they went after $951 million at the Bangladesh Central Bank. The heist was a partial success. $81 million vanished in a matter of days. Money moved from the New York Federal Reserve to a bank in the Philippines. Within 48 hours, conspirators had withdrawn the funds and taken it to a casino, a black box for illicit funds. The money disappeared into untraceable banknotes. To date, the majority has not been recovered. In one sense, the billion-dollar bank heist was all about technology. Malware allowed the hackers to sneak into the Bangladesh Central Bank's computer system. Once inside, they learned how the bank operated, stole employee passwords, and eventually found the cornerstone of global finance, the SWIFT messaging system. SWIFT allows banks to communicate with each other, protecting money transfer requests with military-grade security. The hackers mastered the system and waited until a bank holiday to send false transfer orders to the Federal Reserve. Fed officials processed the first few requests, but stopped when compliance software flagged some messages as suspicious. But while technology was the vehicle for the crime, the larger story is about the strengths and vulnerabilities of global finance. Cross-border ties between banks facilitate trillions of dollars in transfers each day. Open electronic borders allow migrants to send money home to their families, make it easy for tourists to use ATMs in foreign countries, and smooth the way for Apple to build an iPhone with materials from 6 continents. Yet organized crime syndicates, drug cartels, terrorists, and dictators can make use of these same financial pathways. Because finance is so globalized, unsavory actors need only a few countries with weak financial regulation to exploit cross-border banking for criminal purposes. In the case of the Bangladesh bank heist, North Korean hackers chose the Philippines, which allowed its gambling sector to preserve financial secrecy. One loophole, and it was easy to make the money disappear. That was the first, just to give you a sense of why you need all of these countries to work together on this issue. That's why kind of cooperation is urgent. The second selection I was going to read is about specifically the problem of terrorist financing and why it's particularly tricky to kind of regulate. They met in an online chat room. The forum was a place where native-born Somalis, living in far-flung lands that felt strange and unfriendly, could connect. They talked about home and current events, and in particular, the Somali government's ongoing battle against the terrorist insurgent group Al-Shabaab. People disagreed about who should win. Sometimes Al-Shabaab leadership went on the site to try and engage them and win their support. Fervent supporters were invited to join a smaller, private chat room known as the Group of 15. It was here that political support was transformed into a vehicle for financing terrorism. The Group of 15 upped the stakes for Al-Shabaab supporters. Participants not only pledged monthly financial commitments, but were held accountable for meeting them. 2 American women, Hinda Osman Durain and Muna Osman Jama, collected money and sent it to Al-Shabaab contacts in Somalia and Kenya. Between 2011 and 2013, these women transferred thousands of dollars to the organization. The money went to safe houses and transportation, but funds are fungible. Support for Al-Shabaab convoys meant that the group could spend other money on weapons and recruitment. Eventually, U.S. law enforcement discovered the effort. The chat room was shut down, and in 2016, a U.S. court found Durain and Jama guilty of providing material support to a foreign terrorist organization. They were sentenced to more than a decade of jail time. So that's kind of one of the problems when it's related to terrorism, is that terrorism is really cheap. And so if you have money going across borders and it's transferred through these little entities, it's very hard to kind of track it through the banking system, particularly if one country has these gaps that allow it. And then the final selection I was going to read is about the problem of organized crime, and it's from a chapter I have that looks at the Philippines and Thailand. In December 2017, Thai officials cracked open one of the biggest wildlife smuggling operations in the world. The case began with a routine inspection. Customs officers examined suitcases from an incoming flight and searched them for illegal goods. Inside the bags were rhino horns, poached from the world's dwindling and endangered rhino population. The international trade of rhino horns has been illegal since 1977, yet poachers have killed thousands of rhinos in recent years. Despite the illegal cargo, officials appeared to clear the suitcases. The bags traveled through customs, where they were later picked up by a Thai government official working in the airport. From Africa to Thailand, 2 stops in a much larger illicit trafficking operation. Billions of dollars worth of illegal wildlife slips across borders every year. Authorities rarely find the cargo and catch the perpetrators. In this case, however, custom officials tipped off the Thai police. Rather than seize the goods, the police employed a method called controlled delivery, in which authorities allow illegal goods to move through the trade network to locate more participants. Within weeks, Thai authorities had arrested Bak Boon Chai Mai, a Thai national of Vietnamese origin who was notorious in the illegal wildlife trade. Bak and his brother run the Hydra Syndicate, which spans Africa to China and traffics in ivory, rhino horns, tigers, and pangolins. By stopping Bak, the Thai police hoped they had dealt a significant blow to the Hydra network. But if Bak's arrest represented a high point for environmental groups, the aftermath showed how difficult it can be to stop organized crime. Bak was released on bail within a week, allowing Hydra to continue its operations. Even more troubling, in January 2019, a Thai court dismissed charges against Bak after the prosecution's key witness changed his testimony. What had once seemed like a major victory for the fight against wildlife trafficking now reflected the many ways that criminals can slip through the justice system. So just to go, I'm going to skip a little bit. So the international effort to stop money laundering offers a partial workaround to some of these problems. It may not always be possible to send a kingpin to jail, but government officials can seize his assets and make it more difficult for him to use his money. A few years before Thai authorities arrested Bak, the Thai Anti-Money Laundering Office froze 37 million in assets belonging to a woman accused of running a large operation that traffics in rosewood and tigers. So the idea, I guess, that this chapter and this part displays is that when we think about things like terrorism and we think about organized crime, we often approach them from a sort of criminology perspective, where we think about putting the criminals in jail. And what countries have done in this way, that's really come out of starting with the money laundering effort in the 1980s, and then the effort to stop money laundering in the 1980s, and then the broader campaign against terrorism starting after 2000, is to try and enlist banks as essentially enforcers for laws and standards. And so what has made cooperation so successful in this area, the reason they've been able to convince so many countries to change their laws and to prioritize stopping money laundering and terrorist financing, is that this organization uses kind of a public shaming process, a blacklisting process, hence the name, where they put countries that aren't following international rules on a list. And when they're listed, banks, international banks, banks in the US, basically subject customers in those countries to additional scrutiny. And so what happens is, in a place like Thailand or the Philippines, that maybe people don't really, for whatever reason, the governments don't want to change their laws and implement these more stringent standards about money laundering or terrorist financing, these countries end up on this list, and suddenly the banking sector, firms in these countries, find it much harder and more expensive to engage in global finance. And so what happens is that the banking sector becomes a lobby. Basically, they go to the government and they say, you have to comply with these standards. You have to take money laundering and terrorist financing seriously, because it's costing us too much to do business. And so you get this really rapid, widespread transformation in policy. So I don't know if that's like the kind of the nutshell. I don't know if you want me to add other things.
Does anyone want to comment or ask some questions?
I can say that there are, one of the things that makes this research, I think, interesting is that it's about the power of the private sector basically to enforce international rules, and we're seeing a variation of that with what's happening with Russia and Ukraine right now. That the private sector has been really involved in pulling out of Russia. Like more than 300 companies have pulled out. The SWIFT messaging system, which I read about, was one of the first ways that the US and its allies tried to kind of cut off Russian access and basically weaponize this kind of financial interdependence in a way that punishes countries that are on the receiving end.
Was it through this method, through the banks, is that the first time that the government was able to thwart some of these criminal activities?
Yeah, so basically what's happened is it's become a lot more difficult for everyone to use the formal financial system. So it's become more difficult for criminals, for terrorists to access formal finance, to send money. You need two types of IDs. There's all kinds of regulations and protocols. Banks file suspicious transaction reports. So there's a lot of mechanisms in place. The downside of that is that it can also be more difficult for people who are just trying to send money to family, and more expensive. So if you come from Somalia, which is going to be a high-risk country for terrorist financing, and you're just trying to send money home to your family, you are just going to pay a lot more now than you would have 10 years ago because of this effort. So I talk in the conclusion about some of the unintended consequences of this larger effort.
So it's difficult for poor individuals of poorer countries to function internationally, right? Is
Yeah,
that one of the-
or even people here. So you might be working in the United States, but if you're from one of those countries and you're trying to send money through a money transfer operation, you'll find that it costs a lot more to send money to those places because they're viewed as higher risk. And so banks are basically afraid to take on those relationships because they're worried about money laundering and terrorist financing. So they're going to charge you more.
Okay. Is there going to be any issues, bigger picture issues because of this?
I mean, yeah, so there is some broader concerns because what's happened is the banking system has gradually contracted. And so it used to be that banks were basically connected to banks in every other country in the world. It was a very broad network. And over the last 10 years, there's been about 40,000 bank closures, banks closing relationships. And so in certain places, there are some countries like Vanuatu, which yes is a small place, but where people don't have access to formal banking anymore because banks have said they're high risk and they're low yield, and so it's just not worth doing business. So there are positive sides to this effort in that they really have made it more difficult to use formal finance to finance terrorism or money laundering. But the downsides is that they've also made it more difficult for people to engage in global finance, and that raises concerns about kind of equity and financial inclusion.
Interesting. Does anybody?
Yeah. So, are there other sort of global challenges that you think this could be used to address, or is this really specific to sort of counterterrorism and sort of illegal activities?
Yeah, so I like to think that the book is really about the ability to engage market actors in cooperation challenges. And so I think there's other areas where you could do that if you had the right kind of leadership and the right kind of regulation passed. So there is a world in which you could use something similar to this on climate policy. I think the thing that made, though, the FATF work was this coalition of countries that had large economies kind of coming together and agreeing on this particular set of rules. So given the way climate policy is in the US, probably you're not going to see that here. But, for example, the European economy is very large. So, and one of the things we know from global finance is if Europe sets standards, as they are doing right now with data and privacy issues, to some degree, it doesn't really matter if the U.S. has other standards. People will follow those European standards. So you could imagine a world in which the European countries imposed costs on countries that didn't take action on climate change, if there was sort of consensus around that, or tried to engage firms in that action in a way that would allow them to kind of use a similar process.
Does anybody?
Yeah. This is a largely hopeful book on international cooperation, but if you were going to say, take the terrorist point of view and really try to diminish the effectiveness of the FATF, are there any kind of things you worry about in the near and medium future?
Yeah, so I think, the terrorism angle is interesting because the U.S. government treated terrorist financing as kind of the cornerstone of counterterrorism after 9/11. And that was because the 9/11 attacks were, relatively speaking, expensive. So there was about $300,000 that went to pay for the terrorists to have flight training, pay for their food and board, pay for their plane tickets, all of this stuff. And all of that money moved through the formal banking system without any of it being flagged as suspicious. And so at the time, after 9/11 happened, the US government was worried about this is what terrorism looks like, and there was a much larger global approach of we need to think about stopping terrorist financing. But the reality is that terrorists can launch attacks with very little money. And so, these laws are designed to catch the large transfers. They're designed to catch the $10,000 movements or the person who has a previous history of terrorist activity. What they're not going to be able to do are catch the people who are new entrants into the terrorist space and who are using really small amounts of cash. And then, of course, there's the larger concerns about cryptocurrencies and some of the other ways that people might be able to access financing. From what I've seen, I don't think there's a lot of evidence right now that we're seeing actually most terrorists or criminals using that space, but it will obviously be a lot of growth over the years. I mean, particularly if you're sophisticated, which most terrorist groups are not, but more sophisticated ones could use that.
Have you seen a rise of banks maybe competing for business from, looking to get those customers?
Well,
maybe not openly.
Yeah, so banks have competing incentives on this, right? Because banks are profit-based actors, and so, okay, fine, you want to cut off the low-level criminals, but if you're talking about the Sinaloa cartel or one of the big Mexican drug cartels, or you're talking about even Osama bin Laden back in the day when he was had ties to his billionaire family, there maybe you don't want to cut those people off. And so what we see is that banks in part take it seriously because the US, the UK, Singapore, a number of countries around the world have basically fined them pretty massive fines for not when they don't follow these rules. So they are monitored by regulators. So what banks do is they kind of specialize. There are some banks that are open to kind of taking on more risk, and they might operate in Mexico and be willing to take it on. They do some kind of anti-money laundering compliance, but they're more circumspect. There are other banks that will say, we're not doing business at all with those places. We're really focused on white collar clients, or we're focused on European countries. So what it does is it kind of differentiates banks, and they approach these calculations in different ways, actually.
Did you want to talk more about your book, about the structure of the book, how it's laid out? How did you lay out your book?
Sure. So it just has an introduction, the preface, which kind of gives you what I told you, why I think this is an interesting topic. And then an introduction that lays out the book, gives some policy context, how things work, describes the argument. The second chapter is about international financial standards related to illicit financing. So one of the things about this issue area is there are a lot of, they're not international treaties, they're what political scientists call international soft law. So they're agreements that are kind of not officially binding on states, but most states implement, that change how countries govern their banking sectors. And those underlie basically why banks care about the issue of illicit financing in the first place. Because 30 years ago, banks didn't care about that at all. And that's, I think, one of the things that makes it really interesting is that we've seen policy change in this area that's been really, really rapid over a short period of time, versus when we look at a lot of other cooperation problems, it's just much slower moving. So then I have what we could call the classic political science theory chapter, which maybe for the layperson they might want to skip over, to be honest. And then I have a chapter that goes into the FATF and their role in fighting illicit financing. They're created out of the Reagan administration's war on drugs. Basically, the Reagan administration's really committed to the war on drugs. They pass these laws criminalizing money laundering and realize almost immediately that if they are the only country criminalizing money laundering, basically all of the money is going to go to other countries, and they face a real problem. And so they immediately think we need to internationalize this effort, which is how we get this organization set up. And it is a small organization. So at the time it's created, it's the US, the UK, France, kind of a small group of big economies. Today it's 39 members, but it's not most countries in the world. So there is a power element here of this organization that consists of basically the large economies telling all of the other countries in the world what to do with their laws, which, depending on your view of politics, you may or may not think is a good thing. But I was at a meeting once where I heard a representative from a small Pacific Island country say, we don't have a terrorist financing problem. We literally have never caught a terrorist. This is not something we're concerned about. Why do we have to have laws on terrorist financing? And the reason is because the banking system is connected and all countries have to adopt these standards. But there are some concerns about if you're dealing with low capacity countries, this might not be their kind of priority or policy issue.
What do you attribute the lack of participation amongst countries? Is it because of the smaller countries think it's the US, UK, everybody, the big, they have all the money, so why should we join?
Oh no, they're not allowed to join.
They're not allowed.
Yeah, so
Okay.
it's more hierarchical than that. They are invited to join regional bodies in each there's 8 regional organizations who are basically, they were forced to join, but only strategically important countries join. So the two most recent members are Israel and Saudi Arabia. But if you were a small country in South America and you wanted to join Uruguay, you wouldn't be able to.
You join the region.
You
stuff.
join the regional body, because if you don't join the regional body, you'll end up on what is worse than the blacklist, like the list that has just Iran and North Korea on it. The like real bad guys list. But otherwise, you know, they really focus on making sure that all countries participate in the effort.
Do those regional bodies have any say in policy or whatever, or they just have to go along with whatever?
So one of the things that's interesting is that when it started out, they did not give very much voice to those regional bodies. And not surprisingly, they got a lot of political pushback. And so over the years, the organization has learned to try and find ways to kind of increase legitimacy. And so they do involve them more in decision making. They have more in the blacklisting process. They have representation on that. They try and kind of expand the approach and also make it fairly apolitical. It's very technocratic, focused on like banking and standards, so that it does not feel like a, you know, just blacklisting your countries you don't like. And actually the way it works is pretty surprising, but it is not, it doesn't play out like that. You know, the Philippines is a US ally and the Philippines ended up on the list.
Did somebody have a question over here? Well, thank you very much for coming and talking about your book. And everyone, please purchase a copy of Banker's Blacklist right behind the counter. Julia, thank you very much. Thank you.